Joining me is Karina Gomes. Hi, Karina. She is a postdoctoral fellow with the Libin Institute and one of our rising stars. And just a reminder before we get started, make sure that your microphones are off while you are not speaking. Although we would like to keep this interactive and informal. So if you have a question at any time during the lecture, please feel free to use the raise hand function or write a question in the chat box. Megan, Karina, and I will be monitoring the chat box during the presentation. Okay, so what are we going to do today? So we're going to start with a short lecture. We're going to cover the various contexts in which abstracts are used in academia. We're going to learn why it is important to write a good abstract. How do you write a good abstract? We're going to become familiar with the typical structure and content of an academic abstract, and then we'll cover how you would approach each component. After the lecture, we're going to break you out into breakout rooms. Okay, so once you are in your breakout room, what you're going to do is you're going to review one of the abstracts that was provided to you in the sample abstract document that was sent to you through the Summer Student Research Day. Okay, so it was along with the advertisement for this workshop. One of you will be assigned as the screen sharer. Okay, so if you receive an invitation to be a host, please accept that invitation. So your breakout room number will correspond to the abstract number that you will review. Okay, so if your breakout room number 4, you will be reviewing abstract number 4. Some of you will have brought with you, hopefully, the abstract that you have written for the upcoming Summer Student Research Day. So we would like you to apply the knowledge that you learned today and edit your abstract with your group. Okay, so this is a great opportunity for you to apply what you learn and get feedback on your abstract before you submit it in a few days. More than one of you may have brought your own abstract. We will probably have time to review more than one. So the host in the breakout room will have the ability to assign another host. Okay, so another person can go ahead and share their screen and share their abstract. Karina and I will be joining the rooms after around 10 minutes to answer any questions and facilitate any discussion. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start off by highlighting, as a scientist, one of the most important skills for you to have is communication. Okay, so your job is not only to generate research, but in order for your research to make an impact, you need to disseminate it effectively to the broader research community, other stakeholders, as well as members of the general public. So what is an academic abstract? Essentially, it is a brief summary of your completed research, or in some cases, it is your proposed research. Okay, there are a variety of purposes for which you would write an abstract. And of course, your strategy will change a little bit depending on your objective. Okay, so one of the reasons why you would write an abstract is if you were submitting a manuscript to a scientific journal for consideration for publication. Typically the abstract will be placed after the title page and before the introduction. Okay, and essentially it will summarize the primary components of your manuscript. If your manuscript is accepted for publication, the abstract will be published on the journal's website, in the hard copy of the journal edition, and also in academic databases like PubMed or Google search. Okay, so here's an example of an abstract published in PubMed. More recently, some journals like American Journal of Physiology and Cell now require a graphical abstract. So graphical abstract gives the reader a quick visual representation of your work. Okay, so here's an example of a graphical abstract that my lab has recently submitted along with a manuscript to the American Journal of Physiology. Another reason why you would write an abstract is if you are submitting your work for consideration for presentation at a scientific conference or a symposium. Of course, this is the objective for the abstract that you are writing or will write now. Okay, so the organizing committee or reviewers selected by the organizing committee will use your abstract to decide whether the abstract meets criteria for acceptance to the conference, and will also use it to decide whether your work should be selected for oral presentation or poster presentation. Okay, so typically very select abstracts are chosen for oral presentation. The benefits of an oral presentation are that it increases the visibility of your work. Okay, so you will be presenting to all of the attendees at the conference, or if it's a really large conference, you'll be presenting to a subgroup of attendees. The other benefit is that it is great for practicing. So I encourage my students to take any opportunity they have to practice their oral presentation skills, even if that makes them uncomfortable, which for most people it does, okay? Because oral presentation skills are not only important for careers in academia, but important for a lot of different careers. Okay, poster presentations are really good for networking. Okay, so the attendees will come by your poster and talk to you face to face about your work. Now, some conferences do publish the accepted abstracts in a peer-reviewed journal. So in this case, you would indicate on your CV that your abstract is published and include all of the relevant information. So for example, shown here, experimental biology is a very large international conference that's held annually in the US. All of the accepted abstracts are published in the FASIB journal. Okay, so another reason why you would write an abstract is for a grant application. So typically funding agencies want you to submit an abstract that summarizes your proposal. And more often the funding agencies require that you submit a lay summary or a lay abstract. Okay, so a lay abstract is intended for the general public. So the funding agencies use this to promote the research that they have funded to their donors or to other members of the public. Okay, so of course, because this type of abstract is intended for a lay audience, you're going to approach it in a very different way than you would a typical scientific abstract. Okay, and lastly, if you write a thesis, you will include an abstract that summarizes your thesis work. Any questions so far? Okay, a question from Lily. Thank you, Lily. Does that mean we don't get to choose our method of presentation and that they're chosen for us depending on our abstract? So good question. Yeah, so typically what happens, and I think this is the same for the summer student research day, is that there'll be a checkbox and ask you if you want to do an oral presentation. They would only look at those in terms of oral presentation, and then the default will be the poster presentation. But I would suggest that you always indicate that you are interested in an oral presentation. Poster presentations are great, but it looks even better if you do an oral presentation. Will these symposiums be held in person? So, and that's from, and sorry if I say this wrong, Skanda. I assume you're talking about the Summer Student Research Day, which yes, it will be in person. So, of course, it's going to look very different than a normal conference. You know, the poster presentations, obviously there's not going to be a lot of networking because it is remote. Yes. But hopefully next year we can have our regular Summer Student Research Day again. Okay, thanks for the questions, guys. Oh, yes. So I think, yeah, I believe that for the Summer Student Research Day, you will be asked if you want to do an oral. There are actually more than one types of oral present. Well, they're all going to be oral anyway, because even the poster presentations are going to be oral. But there are going to be talks that you will do. There's just going to be a few because we have a lot of students that will present a normal scientific presentation to the entire group. Okay, then we're going to select people for a TED Talk, which is a very different type of talk. It's like a high level talk that you would give to the general public, or, you know, like a group of donors. And then the poster presentations will be in like little select groups. So you're going to be presenting to a smaller group, but it'll still be an oral presentation, really just to a smaller group, not to the bigger group. Okay, so why is abstract writing important? Well, you should think of your abstract as a key tool to promote your research. So if you submit an abstract along with a manuscript, the editors are going to read your abstract and use the abstract to decide whether it merits full review. Okay, then if it goes out for full review, typically the reviewers are going to read your abstract first so they can sort of orient themselves to what they're going to find in your manuscript. Likewise, if you submit an abstract along with a grant application, typically the reviewers are going to read your abstract first. Okay, so in this way, really your abstract is the first impression that you're giving your reviewer. Okay, and obviously you want to make a good first impression. Abstracts that are published along with manuscripts, they serve as a permanent record of your work. Okay, so databases like PubMed and Google Scholar only index abstracts. Okay, and the access to the full manuscript is restricted. So potential readers will first read your abstract and then decide if they want to download the full article. Not all institutions have subscriptions to all journals. So for some researchers, they will only have access to the abstract and not the full article. Abstracts that are accepted for presentation at conferences or symposia will be published in the conference proceedings or in the program booklet. So the attendees will skim through the abstracts to decide which presentations they want to attend. Okay, so the take-home message here is that your abstract is used to evaluate your work and to attract readers to your work. So you don't want to think of it as an afterthought. Okay, so it's not something you just put together last minute. It's really important to write an effective abstract, okay, because it's critical to promote your research. So what makes a good, effective abstract? Well, there are almost always strict word limitations. So it must be brief. And because it is brief, that means you have to present the information in a very concise and succinct manner. Okay, so you're only going to include critical information that allows the reader to understand what you did, why you did it, and why it is important. Okay, and you're going to leave out extraneous information. And for an inexperienced undergraduate student and graduate student, it can be difficult to decide what is important and what is not important. Okay, and so hopefully we can help you with that today. The abstract should be coherent. Okay, so the information should be presented in a logical sequence. So it should be a logical flow of ideas. So you want to think of it as sort of putting together a story. Okay, so do all of the pieces fit together? So is it easy for the reader to understand your results based on how you wrote your methods? Is it easy for your reader to understand why you chose certain methods or an approach based on how you described your objective? Okay. It should be comprehensive. So it has to be brief, but it also has to capture the essence of the work. Okay, it has to capture the novelty and the relevance of your work. It should be able to stand alone. It has to include all of the critical information. And lastly, it should be understandable to a non-expert. Okay, so keep in mind when you submit an abstract to a grant panel or an organizing committee for a conference, the expertise of the reviewers is going to be very diverse. It's unlikely that your reviewer is going to be an expert specifically in your field. Okay, so to be effective, what you want to do is to put yourself in the shoes of your reviewer. Okay, so your reviewer has to review 5 to 20 abstracts in a short period of time. They have a lot of things, other things going on. So you don't want to make it difficult for your reviewer to understand your abstract. You want to make it easy for them. Okay, you want to spoon feed them the information. If they have to work too hard to understand your abstract, they're going to get frustrated. I find that undergraduate students and even graduate students typically overestimate the knowledge of their potential reviewers. Any questions? Okay. If you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the chat box or raise your hand. So what is the typical structure and content of an abstract? If you are submitting your abstract for manuscript, you will refer to the journal instructions. Each journal has unique instructions, and you'll find these on the journal website. If you are submitting your abstract for a conference, the organizing committee will provide you with information on format requirements and the submission process. Like I mentioned, there are almost always word or character count limitations that you must strictly adhere to. Typically, word count limitations range from 150 to 300 words. You will need to include a title. the author list, their affiliations. Sometimes you'll have to include the funding sources. So a lot of funding agencies require that you acknowledge the funding for any work that's submitted. The body of the abstract almost always contains the same information in the same sequence. You're going to start with a very brief background and introduction, which should justify your objectives. Typically, you write your objective, or you could write that in a hypothesis form. You're going to briefly describe your methods and approach, followed by your results, which is the most important part of your abstract. And then you're going to end with a very brief summary of your conclusions and implications. So what does it mean? And Karina will go over these components in more detailed. Sometimes the format requires that you use subheadings for the different sections. Other times it's an unstructured abstract, so it's just basically a paragraph with no headings. Okay, the title. This is an important part of your abstract. So your title is important for visibility. Okay, so many people will read your title, but fewer people will actually go on to read your entire abstract. So your job is to use your title to entice your readers to explore your work further. Search engines and journal websites will use the titles of papers to categorize articles or present them to potential readers. And of course, potential readers will first read your abstract your title before deciding to read your abstract. So you should include key words that capture the relevance and significance of your article or your work. The title should accurately represent what you did, and at the same time as being concise. Studies show that more specific titles lead to more citations. For systemic reviews, you should include the participants, intervention, comparisons, outcomes, study design, and include the terms systemic review, meta-analysis, or both. Sometimes for basic science research, journals will require you to indicate the species studied. Don't be too clever, okay? So using a pun or a play on words might be fun, but your work is unlikely to be picked up by a search engine, and the meaning may be lost on an international audience. Avoid jargon, avoid acronyms and unexplained abbreviations. So essentially, your title should be concise but informative. Okay, and authorship. So you've written your abstract. How do you approach authorship? There are several guidelines that are published on authorship. The journals will have specific criteria, which can be found on the journal website. So most often authors should have significantly contributed to the conception and design of the study, acquisition of data, or analysis and interpretation of the data. They should have either drafted the article or helped in revising it for important intellectual content, and all of the authors need to approve the final version. Authors are listed in order of decreasing contribution. So your first author is going to be the person who really led the project, so they did the bulk of the work. And then other contributors will be listed in order of their contribution. The exception is the last author, which is typically the supervisor or mentor. So this is typically the person who has funded the work, was critically involved in its conception, and sort of oversaw the project. Authorship can lead to conflict. or ethical issues. So it's important for you to figure out the authorship list before you write it, so there are no surprises, and probably best to ask your supervisor. Any questions about authorship or abstract so far? Okay, so I am going to hand it over to Karina, and she's going to finish the rest of the lecture.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. So can you hear me well? Yes, okay. I think I'm having some delay in my chat box, so please, Jennifer, can you let me know if we have any questions here? Okay.
Yep.
So hello, everyone. As Jennifer said, I'm Karina. I'm a postdoctoral scholar from Living Cardiovascular Institute, and it has been a pleasure to help Jennifer with this workshop on abstract writing. I really hope that this workshop will help you to prepare your own abstracts for the research day, or even to improve it for those who are already working on that, as the deadline for the submission for the research day is just around the corner. So now let's talk a little bit about the abstract body. So which components should be part of your abstract structure, and what is the main purpose of which component? We're going to start talking about the statement of problem, or the background, or the introduction of your abstract. So a research problem is an area of concern or a gap in the existing knowledge that points to the need for further understanding and further investigation. So the statement of problem will be used for a research work as a claim that outlines the problem addressed by your study, by your research. So in your abstract, the statement of the problem should be the first few sentences that will give the reader the important background about your hypothesis and about your work. Usually, this is the shortest part of your abstract. So between 2 or 3 sentences, sometimes even in a single sentence may be sufficient to describe your background. Because we have to remember that we have the word count limitation here. So we must be brief in the background. In this statement of problem is where we're gonna explain why do we care about this problem and the results, what research problem or concern are you trying to solve with your research, and what is the scope of your work, if it is a more generalized approach or in a specific situation, and what is the gap in the knowledge that you are trying to fill. So the statement of problem will help the reader to clearly identify your motivation for this particular research. So we have here an example for a statement of problem in an abstract. So here we said that diabetic cardiomyopathy is the leading cause of mortality between diabetic patients. Although remarkable progress has been made in the recent years, there is no specific therapy for myocardial damage induced by this condition, mainly due to its unclear molecular basis. So it's very briefly, but we can understand here the problem of this research. So we have to understand the molecular basis for the diabetic cardiomyopathy. And here we have important background information that stand for the high mortality levels of this condition. So for the statement of problem, we should avoid lengthy background. We should exclude extraneous or repeated information and include only what is needed to orient the reader to your hypothesis or objective. So your abstract will begin with this brief but precise statement of the problem or issue. So if you have any questions, you can ask me. Yeah, I cannot even see here. Okay, so Jennifer, can you please go? Okay, it's already there. Thank you. Okay, so the next part of your abstract will be the aim or the hypothesis. For an abstract, you may choose to write an objective or an aim, or even write only the objective in the form of a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a proposed explanation of something that has to be verified and tested before it can be widely accepted as a fact. So a hypothesis has a direction. Aim instead is the goal, the purpose of the process. So while hypothesis can not always be true, you can have like a negative hypothesis, the aim must always be true and specific in order to effectively prove your hypothesis. One of the most common mistakes in the aim description is state a broad objective that your actual experiments will not cover. So we have to be careful to ask the questions in the aims and make sure that you will answer these questions with the experiments and the approach that you use it in your research. Both of aim and hypothesis, they must be focused to reflect exactly what you are doing in your research. So you have to be careful to not be like too much vague while you are writing these statements. Another important thing about aims and objectives is because they should be clear, as I said, and concise, and they must be hypothesis driving. So this is the gold standard of science. You think in one hypothesis based on your observations, and you test this hypothesis with experiments, with controls. So a hypothesis should be a specific and testable prediction about what you expect to happen in your study. So now we know that the hypothesis is the idea that you will test to achieve your aim. And we can think of it as a question that you like to answer through your study. Then we can frame it as a statement to be proven, true or not, by your study. So, for example, we have here is a hypothesis of an abstract. In this study, we will test the hypothesis that intriguing adhesions and associated cellular signaling complexes mediate mechanotransduction in the cerebral arterial myogenic response. So we can see that it's a specific and testable idea. It's not like too much vague or too much broad. Can you please go to the next slides? Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the methods or the approach for your research abstract. The methods sections is usually the second longest section in the abstract. So it should contain enough information to enable the reader to understand what was done and how it was done. So the methodology or the methods usually summarize the basic design and the techniques that were used in your study. So here you want to give enough information so the reader can understand the key methods and the key approaches that were used in your study. To write the methods, it's always important to try to respond this question. So how did you go about solving or making progress on the problem? So it's important to describe the variables that did you control for your experiment, or it's important to give like as much detail as possible. Of course, that we have to always think about the word count, but some informations, they are really important that should be stated in the method section, so it will be clear for the reader what approaches you use it for your study. But it must be clear, but at the same time, you cannot include like unnecessary detail. So with a think about the difference between key informations versus non-important information. For example, it's important to state what primary cell culture you use. For example, primary cell culture or versus immortalized cell line. But you don't have to include like details of the culturing, like media, like carbogen levels. So you have to know which informations are important to understand the question that is being asked, but you don't have to put all the details of your experiments because once again, we have to be careful about the word count limit. So for biological or clinical research, include organisms, cell line, or population studies. And for clinical trials, it is important to mention the sample size, the patient group, the dosage, and the duration. So the method sections of your abstract is your chains, to summarize the basic design of your study. So excessive detail is unnecessary, but you must briefly state the key techniques and information that were used. Next slide, please. Okay. So the results sections. Now we have the most important part of the abstract. And nothing should compromise its range or quality. So we have to put like some more effort to write the results because most of the people who read your abstract, they do so to learn about the findings of your study, of your research. So the results section should be the longest part of the abstract and should contain as much detail about the findings and the word count permits. So in the results sections, we must summarize the key findings of our study. So what is the answer for your research problem? What did you discover in your research? And it's very important to give directionally to your results. So it's important to state the magnitude of change. You can use some fold change calculations to do that. It's important to include the sample sizes, the mean, the standard deviation, the standard error mean, and the statistical significance of your work. So here you should try to maximize the details. One important tip about the way that you can describe your data is while you are reporting the data along with the standard error, you must round one decimal place more than the mean value. So we can see that in the example here. So if you have a mean value of 4.2, you can state the standard error as the standard deviation as 0.13. So this is a pattern that we use to describe the data. So here it's important to notice two different types of way that we can describe our results. So in the first example, we have a very brief and not detailed format for your data results to describe the data. And we have here cytokine levels were changed after high fat feeding. Okay, we know that the levels were changed, but it doesn't bring like too much information. We don't know exactly what happened in this study. So we have a better example here. The cytokine levels were increased by twofold in mice fed with high-fat diet versus control diet. And we have the mean value for that, the standard deviation, and we have the significance of the data here. So here we have like much more details and it's we can understand better what happened in this study. Another tip about the statistical significance, you don't have to write for all the data if it was like statistical different or not. But if you put the p-value, it's already indicate that the level of significance of your results.
We have a question in the chat box.
Okay.
So Megan asks, what should you include in the results section if your study is still in progress, the expected results? Yeah, so a lot of you, I mean, this will probably be a situation that a lot of you will be in. So you're going to write what you're going to do. You can write a little section on what you're expecting. I mean, that would also be included in your hypothesis. Yeah, so you're really just, you're not really going to have a results section. You're just going to write about what you are doing, and then the implications of the work, you know, in the case that your hypothesis is correct.
Yeah, exactly. And if you have some preliminary data, you didn't finish the study yet, but you have some preliminary data, you can also describe it in the abstract. It's fine. You just have to say that this is the preliminary data of your study.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you could ask your supervisors or any data that you can include just to create a story. If you do present someone else's data, though, you must acknowledge that whoever did the work. And then another question going off that, what do you do if you have a qualitative focus and you can't necessarily predict your results? So yeah, you're just going to, in the best way, describe what you are doing, and help them understand why you're doing that, and be specific as possible. Yeah, we'll be able to provide better feedback if you have your abstract with you and in your groups, and we can see what it's all about. Thank you.
Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? So finally, the conclusion section, it should contain the most important take-home message of your study. So it should be also expressed in a few but precisely ordered sentences. Usually for the conclusion, we also use between 1 or 2 sentences. And the finding here is highlighted. So you have to sum up your findings, but not repeat the findings because you already described them in the result sections. So it's also important to put in your conclusion some other important or unexpected findings. So you always must mention that too. And in the conclusion, the authors can also express an opinion about the theoretical or practical implications of the findings, or the importance of their findings for the field. So the final sentence, you can use a final sentence or 2 in your abstract to summarize your conclusions and in the implications of findings. As I said, this section should be devoted to the overall take-home message of your study. And here we have a good example of the difference of finding and implication. So in the first sentence, we have cytokines, TNF-alpha and IL-6 levels were increased in adipose tissue of mice fed with high-fat diet versus control diet. So this is basically the same results that we can see in the results section. It's the finding of the study, but it's not the conclusion or the implication of your study. And the second sentence, we have high-fat diet feeding lead to an increase in adipose tissue inflammation. So here we are using the same information from the first sentence, but we have the implication of that in the research field. So a good way to begin this section is maybe using some phrases as our study revealed that, or overall, we conclude that. It can help you to describe the implication of your results in the conclusion section. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Okay. So now we have got an idea of the components of your abstract and and their structure. And once you do that, you will get into the nuts and bolts of how to write this abstract. So again, the key here is really clear, direct, ambiguous writing. So, which is the appropriate for a scientific communication. But don't be afraid to look back at those papers or previous abstract from your lab that you read maybe a few weeks ago. So you can dig them out again and look to those papers, look to the abstracts from your lab and see how they work, how they describe the data, how they explain your questions. So I'm not telling here to copy them, but to use them as a guide to help you to learn how to communicate and what you are trying to say in a scientific manner. So again, you must reread your text like many times, make sure that it is clear, that it like sounds smoothly. Sometimes it's a good idea to ask for a colleague in your lab or a friend to read the abstract for you, especially if it is someone that is not from the field. So this person can help you with some type mistakes and even to give some feedback if the message of your abstract is clear or not. So for me, even today, one thing that I like to do when I've gotten something draft, I like to read it out loud myself. And at least for me, it's something about hearing me read it out loud makes a huge difference and helps a lot to see if the abstract is clear enough, if the language is clear enough, and it's a good abstract. So take your test, read it a lot. And if it is short, it's direct, if you don't have any grammar mistakes, you can check the verb tenses. I know that that is a common question because sometimes we can get a little bit confused about the verb tenses in the abstract. So it should be, we have to do that in a way that you feel comfortable. Usually we can use the present or the past tense, but it's not a good idea to use as in the future. It's not a good idea to extend future sentences, but it kind of goes off the both ways. So you can use a present or a past tense, and you can also use the active or the passive tense. So if you are still working on the experiments, as we have the question here, some people are still working on that and have the preliminary data yet, maybe it's a good idea to keep it in the active verb tense. So you can say something like, the preliminary results indicate, or the results will show that, because we still don't have the final results of your study. Instead to use we found or we haven't found, because you don't have it found it yet. You are still doing that and working on that. So maybe when you are still working on the experiments, it's a good idea to use the active voice. But if it is the case and your experiments are done, and if you have already the answers for all your questions, and you are completely done with your research, you probably could go back and say, we did it in this way, we did that way, and the results show it that. So if you are done with your research, maybe it's a better way to write something like that. And whatever we decide to use, the active or passive voice, or the present or the past tense, try to be consistent with the whole abstract. Don't be switching back. I think that is the key. Don't be starting with the active voice, like we analyzed the samples and then switching to passive voice in the next sentence, like the samples were analyzed, and then going back to active voice. So that can give you some bad feedback for your abstract. So try to be consistent, and probably you're gonna have a good abstract writing with that. Okay, can you go to the next? Okay. So style points in the abstract. Another common question that we usually have about the abstract writing is about citations. So, you know, a citation is where you reference somebody else's work that came before yours. My general rule of thumb to that is try to avoid citations in abstract, because you are trying to be more concise here. You are trying to use less words to describe what you want, and you are trying to be more general. But that is not a completely requirement. So citation typical, it's to be a little, it's more a detailed writing, but depending of the case, if your work is based in a specific methodology that was described from some previous research, it's okay, you can go ahead and cite this work. But if you want to, I think it's better, and if you can, it's better try to avoid citations to keep the abstract in the more general way, and it should be not that much detailed. So I think we have a question. Oh, no questions. Okay. So, okay. So as I said, I usually try to avoid using reference for the abstract, because it should be something more generic. It should be more like a big picture of your work, but you can use it. It's not like something mandatory. So again, you must try to not go in too much details except for the result section. So we stay out of the weeds. You can imagine that you are looking to this work as a 5,000 foot level. So you want to stay out of the details, but even though you have to try to be clear enough so that any audience can read your abstract and understand your work. So yeah,
I think we'll just skip to the last slide, Karina, because we're almost at 2 p.m.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So they have time.
Okay.
So we're going to put you in your breakout rooms soon. These are just some questions that you want to consider while you're reviewing the abstracts. So if you want to quickly jot this down. Does the introduction provide a clear rationale for the study? Is the objective or hypothesis clear? Does it reflect what was actually done? Are the key methods and approaches described? Do you understand what was done and why? Are the methods suited to test the hypothesis? Is there any unnecessary information or redundancy? Are the results clear? Do they have a direction to them? Are there values, sample sizes, and statistical significance described? Do the findings support the conclusions? And do you understand the implications of the work and the overall writing quality of the abstract, or any problems with sentence structure? Is the abstract written for a non-expert? Okay, so Megan is now going to put you into your groups. So remember, one of you will be a screen sharer. You can share your screen. So you're going to be using the abstract sample document that we provided to you. Because we only have a half an hour left, if you have a few in your group that have your own abstracts, maybe just skip right to your own abstracts. Okay, and Karina and I will be going in and out of the rooms. If you do have a question while you are in your room, then you can come back to the main room and ask the question, and we'll send you back out. Okay, so I think everyone's back in here. So just wanted to thank everyone for coming to the workshop. Hopefully you got something out of it, and good luck on writing your abstracts, and looking forward to learning about your work during the Summer Student Research Day. Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting now. Bye.
Just a quick, I got a quick question about the research day. So I think it's going to be virtual, right? Not in person.
Yes, virtual.
So just to confirm that, will be virtual. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.